you.
Welcome, Commissioner.
So pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. So the reason we invited her, obviously, because not only is she the Commissioner for the Office of General Services, but she's also of Trinidadian descent. And this is the reason why we have her here. Well, many reasons, obviously, but that's a great one for her to be here. So we're pleased to welcome her. I clearly am going to represent Guyana, and she's giving me a lot of grief because my flag is smaller than hers. But that's okay.
Just a touch.
But that's okay. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions. So I want to say welcome again on behalf of all of us here at SUNY Downstate and those who are online. Thank you so much. So Commissioner, can you tell me a little bit about your connection to Trinidad, your family, fun stuff, food, how much time you've spent there?
So my family has been from Trinidad since 1903. And I'll joke a lot of times that, in Trinidad, along with a lot of Caribbean nations, it's a very small community. So a lot of times, you say 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, right? Someone can always find one of my family members. So my parents are both born and raised in Point Fortin. My family's been in Trinidad since 1903. And so every summer, that's where I headed, down in Point. I have family in, if you're familiar with Trinidad, St. James, Arima, Trin City, Port of Spain, sort of all around the country. And that's where some of my fondest memories are. And I will say, I was raised in a very West Indian household. I think, especially being in America, I think people, they treat you the way that you appear.
Yes.
And so, I certainly have a very strong Asian American identity, but the household I was raised in is a Trinidadian one. And that means that from my parents' perspective, that means the emphasis on education, the work ethic, the need to always, they were small business owners, and that is through 3-4 generations down in Trinidad, and that applies up here. And so my parents had a hardware store, and a large way in which they interacted with their community was very similar to the way, Moy's store in Point Fortin or Eddie's store in Point Fortin for both of my parents, how they were raised there as well. And so that has very much informed how I was raised here in the United States. I used to think, I joke about this all the time, that chicken with pigeon peas was Chinese food, right? Like I had no idea in actuality that, I had a very West Indian upbringing. And those are things that I started to identify and understand later on in life.
Well, we're appreciative because it's not very often that we have the opportunity to speak to somebody at a significant level, particularly in government and some other places that clearly identify with their background. And it's culturally important for us as a unit, particularly in the world that we focus on now in diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a very critical thing, and it impacts all aspects of our life. One of the things that you'll notice, and Jeanette can tell you this, no 1 or 2 West Indian people look the same. And she alluded to that when she talked about, her Asian upbringing. Similarly, in Guyana, people say to me, well, you don't look Guyanese. And I say, well, what does a Guyanese person look like? We're known as the land of 6 peoples. None of us look the same. And one of the things that people seem to misunderstand is that you can look a certain way and still have a Caribbean heritage. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that might have impacted you in the way that you interact with people?
Oh, 100%. It's funny. It also relates to how I talk to my children in life, right? I think I have a very multicultural family. And so, I'm one of the few of my cousins that are Chinese in terms of our ethnicity. So both my parents were Chinese and their parents and so on and so forth. But, a lot of folks in my family are, part Indian, part Black, and this is sort of the legacy of Europeans in the West Indies, right? And so every country, every European nation at some point in time has had control of Trinidad because it is right off the coast of Venezuela. It was strategically important. And that legacy informs how communities were structured, right? So, you have a lot of, those are from Indian descent, African descent, and Asian, whatever else it might be, everyone is represented in Trinidad. And so it also influences, I think, the way in which I've interacted growing up because, my father will always say, if you say a bad word about anyone, that's your family right there, right? So you always have to be you're a lot more, I think, aware of some of these, interplays and relationships. I think also sometimes a lot more the ways in which it applies here in the United States. A Black American as compared to a Black Trini, very, very different, right? Your upbringing and, and especially being a Guyanese person, lots of different cultural influences into how you approach most situations. And I think those are just, in a lot of ways, it makes us a little more thoughtful. And I'm not saying more thoughtful as in comparatively, but I think I find myself asking often when I talk to people, what is your upbringing? What is your ethnicity, but what was your upbringing, right? What was your family like? And how does it influence the way that you think? You and I were talking a little bit before about mental health issues. And I think about it in terms of my own family when we think about, do you talk about mental health? Do you talk about wellness? Do you talk about and we're sitting in a healthcare setting. Do you talk about illnesses? Right? And how you work through them or how you address them and sort of like the nuances of that. And all of those I can see within my own family in very different fashions and ways.
I know, and that's one of the things that, again, we were talking about earlier. We don't really have the conversations typically in communities of color, but there are other factors socially and culturally that help us to navigate away from it because it's easier to not discuss something. We don't talk about mental health illness in Black communities as large, but even less so in communities of culturally different and diverse backgrounds because there's a taboo to it. And we have to get beyond that real, the thinking that continues to drive the circumstances that keep bringing us to places where we don't need to be. And this is one of the things that I know is very important to you in terms of how we connect with the Caribbean communities, right? If we are to serve a community, we have to be able to understand who they are at all aspects. And one of the reasons that I enjoy working with Commissioner here is because she can give you a little more detail about it, during the onset of the pandemic, she was still at Public Health Solutions, and she called me and she said, what can we do to help? How can I help SUNY Downstate? And she can share a little bit more about what she's done.
And I think, look, the pandemic was hard on everyone, right? And I think one of the most devastating things there was a feeling of helplessness for all of us. So Public Health Solutions, for those of you who don't know, it's a nonprofit in New York City. It's one of the largest non-hospital health nonprofits in New York. And what it does really well is it does a handful of things, but one is that it does contracting. So it receives federal dollars, it dispenses on behalf of the city, it receives city council dollars, and it does it in much more expeditious fashion so that whether you are a hospital or you are providing sexual and health and reproductive services, or you are, pick a nonprofit, they are all very well aware of PHS because they receive funding through us. And every nonprofit had such a challenge during the pandemic of how do I keep my staff safe? What does this mean in terms of the people that I serve? What does this mean in terms of the city of New York? And so something as simple as making sure that people have PPE, right? And you remember the panic that we all felt, right? How do I find a good ventilator? How do I know that it's going to work? How do I find an N95 in which it's been tested? And since PHS had done so much contracting year over year, and we do so much work with the hospitals and nonprofits, we became a very natural convening point to think through how do we look at distribution, which community groups are needed. And as you remember, during the pandemic, there was also a lot of challenges that were happening in our communities, and there were a lot of Black Lives Matter protests. And one of the wonderful things that we were able to do was we were the recipients of testing kits, which were gold back in those days. Whether or not someone actually is a carrier of COVID, right? Whether or not they could possibly pass an infection. And thanks to you, Dawn, and thanks to SUNY Downstate, we were able to get PPE to your organization. We were able to get testing kits to your organization that was not just going to the folks that were a part of and serving clients right here in this hospital. And SUNY was so devastated during that time. But also, when your staff were out supporting protesters and reacting to the awful things that were happening in our communities, that they were able to pass out PPE so that you could civically participate and also be safe, right? Because a lot of communities were they were putting their own bodies at risk to raise the challenges that were happening in policing, in terms of our communities, in terms of loss and death, and to be able to provide both PPE and testing kits so that you could be more safe in that fashion. It was really one of the best things I thought that we did.
It was, and I wanted to say thank you also, because through the work that PHS did through Commissioner Moy, Dr. Robert Gore and his CAVI organization benefited, and also the members of White Students, I think I have it right, White Coats for Black. I think I'm saying that incorrectly, but I think you all understand. So I want to say a special thank you to them all for really putting themselves on the line and being out there on the front line for those who were participating in the demonstrations at the time to be able to be safe. And our folks were out there really helping to make that happen. So I want to say thank you for that.
Absolutely. And those were really difficult times. I remember we were having daily stand-up calls where something as basic as, the awful questions, like who knows where to find body bags, right? Like those are the type of deep, sorrowful conversations that were happening, and giving an outlet not just to try to find resources, but also to mourn it, to connect with others, to talk about what communities were going through. That was one of the most difficult times of the pandemic. Absolutely does not compare, frankly, to what happened here at SUNY Downstate because of some of the tragedies, not just in terms of the community, but also in terms of the staff. And so deeply appreciative, again, of everything that has happened here and that support.
Yeah, we were named as a COVID-only facility during that time, so obviously we had a very difficult time managing that. But I must say that the staff here at SUNY Downstate, our first responders, everybody had really come together, and there's been just a reconnection for people. We tend to think of the pandemic as something really horrible, and it was, but I think, there are positives that have come out of it. There's a greater connection for people. There's a recommitment to the work that we're doing here at SUNY Downstate, and that's critical for us in the work that we do, and for partners like PHS, and for the governor's office, and for OGS.
And I think, this is a moment also where it was incredibly uplifting to see people try to figure out how do we connect with each other and how do we support. I remember coming to your house, actually, and you gave me the best chicken with pigeon peas that I've had in quite some time. But, so just being able to...
This is how I bribed her to come back today. I made some yesterday, but I must say that she also returned the favor, because as she was dropping off masks to my house for me to share in our community, she would drop off food from Trin City, the doubles, okay? So I'm just saying. So I returned the favor.
Supporting our Caribbean restaurants as well. So Trin City being
that
delicious.
Was critical, and as Queens residents, she's left Queens temporarily while she's going to be in Albany, but we make sure that she's connected.
Yeah, no, and this is actually one of the beautiful things about being from a Caribbean nation, is that the islands are so small, and that sooner or later someone is going to know. Someone will keep talking to you until they figure out how you're connected, which happens all the time, right? Yes. So my mother, God, this is going to come out. So my mother went to St. Joseph's Convent. My father went to St. Mary's, and there are so many people that will come back to me and say, "I knew your grandfather way back when," and make a phone call, and this is how. But it also, in some ways, this is one of the things I remember my grandmother telling me. Always be yourself and always stand tall, because everyone knows you at the end of the day.
That's
right?
very true.
And so, you want to conduct yourself from a values perspective where you know that you have to mean what you say. The other thing that I've learned that's very Caribbean is always telling the truth. My mother would always tell me, always say what you mean, because if you say it in multiple rooms, it's going to come back to you. And this is also because my mother has no filter, right? So she just...
Most Caribbean moms don't.
This is a thing, right? So, you're better off saying in every single room exactly what you're going to say in another, because it always comes back, right? So you act with ethics, you talk clearly, and you talk directly, sometimes without tact, but that is part of the charm, I think. So.
It is part of the charm, and I think, as you get older and you start to really identify with your parents in a very different way, you find the things that they taught you, and you used to say, really, what? You find that you're doing the same thing. I mean, I think it's just life in general. the cycle becomes the cycle. The circle is the circle. And you repeat the things that you say you're never going to do as a West Indian parent. I'm never going to do that. And you say, wait, I just did the same thing and I said the same thing.
Oh,
But it's unique in that sense because we are so unique.
I believe so too. I mean, it's funny. I remember there are so many things my mother used to tell me not to do until I got old. Why am I telling these stories? And so she would tell me, she used to joke and say, you can marry whoever you want, but don't bring home a West Indian. I'm like, Mom, have you seen your husband? Or she would say, like, the one thing I remember I was scared to do until I was in my 20s could go back for carnival.
Oh,
so,
okay.
God forbid she caught me playing mass. that would be the end of it. But finally worked up my nerve. Because the other fear that you have as a Caribbean child is your family, right?
Right.
Like,
they're going to see you.
And you'll get licks, doesn't matter how old you are. Right? So I remember sometime, by the time that I was in my 20s, I was like, okay, I'm 26. I think I can go back to play mass. So,
and did you?
I did.
And how was it?
It was a lot of fun, actually. I think this is the beautiful, if you've ever been to Trinidad for Carnival, what's lovely is you get to actually perform. You get to be in the bands, you're a part of the energy. It's not like other carnivals where you're watching, you're a part of that vitality, right? Like you get to be a part of it. I remember I have a lot of friends down there who actually, they'll make the costumes. My dad's best friend growing up won Grand Monarch one year. Because of his designs. And so, these are things when I was growing up, and I remember even as a child, my parents would take me to the West Indian Day Parade, and we would talk about, Moko Jambis and like, what does it mean to be, to watch a steel pan performance, and what is panorama like? And growing up listening to the Mighty Sparrow and how that influenced, because who doesn't, right? Who doesn't love? And these are all the things that are part of my cultural touchstones, which I never really appreciated until I was older, having these conversations that, this really influenced my upbringing in a very unique way, right? In a very Caribbean way, in a very way that is also, I will say, there are so many people from the Caribbean community that are here in New York that it is a way that also you connect with so many people in New York as well. And you had asked before around what sort of carries. The truth is the Caribbean community is just so large and so many have come here right into New York. And that is actually, 25% or so of—
Roughly.
And so in terms of how many are right here in New York, it's like almost equal numbers as right back in some of our home nations. And it's influenced everything. You think about the pandemic, Caribbean Americans are healthcare workers, they're transit workers, they are essential workers. And so even when you think about the pride that you have in terms of standing up and fixing things, right? And being a part of that very action-oriented, I'm at the front and like, this may not be a sorrow I requested, but I'm here to address it. That is part of, I think, that is part of our culture and our pride.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. I just want to go back for a quick moment of bragging here. So let's do a little bit of homework here. So I did a bit of a research, and I want to thank the Office of Human Resources for helping me to do this. Roughly 15% of SUNY Downstate staff identify as Caribbean. But let me tell you, the Jamaicans are running things, okay? I'm just telling you. Guyana is number 2. And Trinidad's bringing up the rear.
Well,
so it doesn't matter the size of my flag, we're still ahead.
I would say this is where diversity, equity, inclusion is important. So you're going to have to beef up some of your recruitment. There are my cousin right now. He lives in San Fernando, and he is a doctor. Actually, a number of doctors. They study in Trinidad, right? They're at the University of the West Indies. They come up here, whatever else that might be. So you should be recruiting from there, right? And that will help to bring up your numbers as well. So.
Okay,
I'm not saying hire my cousin. But,
we'll have those conversations. No, I appreciate that. And this is one of the fun reasons I enjoy working with and knowing her. There's such an ease working with her, and she's very, very, as you can see, she's very open and friendly, and it makes it easier for people to work with her. So let me go back to some of the things that you're working on here in OGS. So I know that there's some work happening on zero emission vehicles. Tell me about that.
So it's funny. I'll say on a side note. So OGS, for those who don't know, OGS does a lot of the operations on behalf of state agencies, right? So we're a support entity. We do procurement. We do about $30 billion worth of contracts in a given year. We do design and construction activities. We are the home of the Office of Language Access, which is very familiar, I think, because there are so many different languages spoken in the Caribbean. So we look to make sure that agencies are better communicating with New Yorkers that may have limited English proficiency. And we are also trying to adapt to be a more sustainable organization. So whether it's the ways in which our construction practices include sustainability, the design of our facilities, and to your point, cars. So I drove down here in an EV car.
Yes.
Very, and which is a great experience. If you're in charge of actually implementing on behalf of Governor Hochul, we're looking to convert 18,000 light-duty vehicles across the state in the fleet into electric vehicles. And there's so many implications to that: the infrastructure, the usage, the adoption, and frankly, some of the user anxiety that folks have about moving to an EV.
That is true. Well, we actually have, I think about 2 years ago, we installed, in collaboration with Con Edison, an EV charging station.
Oh, wonderful.
So we have to share that with you as you leave.
I could have been charging all this time. Why did I not know?
There are 4 charging stations out there, and hopefully we can expand that later down the road. But we understand how important it is because we do want to reduce our carbon emission. And with leadership from the governor's office, leadership from the city, the state, and other entities, this is the way that we as SUNY Downstate can do our part. And we try to encourage other people to do the same. Now, I want to jump back to what you talked about with language access. Can you share some of the impacts the office has had? What are some of the challenges?
So we are the second ever state to create an Office of Language Access. And so this program has always existed, or it has for a few years, to try to help agencies in terms of interpretation, in terms of translation, getting the right contract access. And healthcare workers know this more than anyone, right? Because God forbid you are not getting the information from the patients in the language that they are comfortable with, you may not be giving them, you may not be getting the right diagnosis, you may not be getting giving the right treatment, you may not have a holistic view. And so for many New Yorkers from a limited English proficiency background, many of us may remember translating for our parents, right? Or having to call on a child to translate on behalf of someone else. And the quality of service when you have to rely on a third party where you don't know, are they proficient? Are they truly proficient? Are they understanding the nuance of your policy? Are you interpreting and providing information in the right forum? Those are all very challenging pieces. And the city of New York, the state of New York is one of the most diverse, not just in the country, but in the world. And so our job is to make sure that if you are a person with limited English proficiency, that there is a mechanism by which you can contact anyone, right, within state government. And so you think about it in terms of if you're a small business and you want to be in compliance, you want to make sure that if you're opening a restaurant, you can ask the questions that you need to. You need a liquor license, that you're able to talk to the state liquor authority. That if you are talking to the Department of Health over early intervention, that you're able to get answers in the language that you're most comfortable in. And those are really critical. And I say this, so my husband is from Hong Kong. I mean, he was born in Hong Kong. He came here when he was 5. And his mother, her English is conversant enough that she can make it on a subway, but not so sufficient that she can do her taxes on her own. And I always joke all the time, I know 100% what it is to be successful. It means that if she has to apply for home heating, that she can submit that application without having to go to us, right? That she is able to interact and ask basic questions, which she may or may not want to ask through us on her own. And so that's a very personal approach. I will say, when you think about communities of color, whether you or I, the ability to think about all the ways that your life has unfolded and the people that you've spoken to and lived alongside, and having the blessing to be able to apply that in all of our jobs is incredible. I've been commissioner now for 18 months. I know you and I had worked together in the mayor's office. And I have 2 jobs in some ways. And one is that I'm the commissioner of a huge agency. And I thank God every day for that opportunity. And I thank Governor Hochul for also appointing individuals of color from all across the state, and to not just roles within her administration, but substantive, meaningful roles where we can really move the dial. And my other job is to be a part of her cabinet. And that means for all of the agency heads that are leading our agencies that we are talking to each other about how policies connect. We are talking about the ways and the levers of state government that need to move in order to support New Yorkers. And that is a very distinct privilege. I am one of the few Caribbean Americans that sit on the cabinet, and one of the few Asian Americans. And that sits on me. I think it sits on all of us as individuals of color or women or whatever is our incredible diversity that we bring to the table. And we think not just about how does that inform our jobs, but also what responsibilities do we have about the voices that we lift up, and frankly, the voices that we bring behind us as well. Like who's coming behind my place, and what does that look like? You've always been such a great advocate for not just in terms of structurally what you do, but also as an individual. When you and I met, as you know, I was a young policy person. I think it was my first job in public service. And I came to your area, you were in the press office, to just take a break from City Hall. Like I was just walking around and people had their hair on fire and I just snuck in. I remember thinking, Dawn. And you were a mentor to me. And I appreciated that you would be a place of calm, like a little bit of an oasis.
I was the only calm person in that place.
Oh, well.
And for those of my friends in the old press office who are looking, I know. Same story. I'll live by that.
But that's actually very important to set that context, right? And I think also, I've talked with many people about things like imposter syndrome. Am I ready to do the job that I'm in? And what I loved talking about with you was to remember all the things in our lives that prepared us for this moment, and to just seize it because these times are fleeting. The chance to be in a leadership role and to apply your learnings to sort of move institutions, that is such a privilege. And I think about that all the time in terms of what are my priorities for work? How do I want to approach the work that I'm doing? And how do I want to live? It is very hard to have big jobs and to also have kids at the same time, to have children, and also be in that sandwich generation where you're not just worrying about your kids, but all of a sudden you're worrying about your parents. And West Indian parents, by the way.
Yes.
They are hardworking. They are incredibly focused on their children. They do not always listen to doctors.
No.
They do not always want to admit that health problems exist. And having even that context to ask those questions and to be thoughtful about it, those are very difficult things to bridge.
No, you're absolutely right. And there are two things I want to go back to. You're talking about language access. I know here at Downstate that we do have many folks who are able to translate for our patients who come in who are concerned about a language barrier. So I want to thank the folks who do that. I want to thank the folks in social work and the other departments who work with our patients who come in and need translator services. And the other piece I want to talk about, and we talked about this, we hear the phrase work-life balance, but there is no such thing as a work-life balance. Your work and your life are the same. How do you distinguish between your children and your work? Because as you're preparing dinner and you've got that, I was going to say BlackBerry and date myself, but as you've got that phone in your hand and you're on a call or Zoom call and you're preparing dinner and you're combing your child's hair and overseeing the homework, you realize that one has really sort of melded into another. But what I think is critical for us, and I know that Jeanette can really understand this, is that you have to really focus on the thing you're doing, even if you're focusing on 4 things in a minute. And, you talked about imposter syndrome. Many of us struggle through this. As working parents, my kids are older now, but I'm still a parent. That doesn't change because they're 23 and 27. It doesn't change. But we have to find a way to make sure that it works for us. And for someone like Jeanette, who's in a huge role with, I don't know how many entities reporting into you, this is a serious balance. And I raise my hat to you and your West Indian parents for preparing you for this, because that is what they do for us. It is really about the hard work, and it's not to distinguish or to take away from any other cultural or societal group or ethnic group who do similarly. I just think that we are very unique. We are very unique in that sense. Our Caribbean parents are very, very different, right?
I mean, I think, one of the I think my parents had a much harder job than I did. I'll be honest. I think I think about my mother coming here in her 20s. Not even, she came here because in Trinidad, you're graduating at 17, right? And so she came here for college. She went to Queens College. My father came before, and he was a little bit more of a rebel. So he was here before my mother. They grew up together in Point Fortin, and they didn't know anything about the educational system. They didn't know where was the right place to live, where was the right place to work, how to buy a house, all of these areas in which if you had a long-standing community in New York, maybe you'd know how to navigate it. But they came here, and my mother worked at a bank. She had to leave the bank when she had us. They opened up the hardware store. My father drove cars for Hertz for many years. He worked in a restaurant, was awful at it. And so I think he broke more dishes than he ever earned money. And he ended up opening this hardware store. And that was really, really hard work. I think that's also where I learned how to say sir and ma'am all the time, was just because.
And to count change.
And to count change, right? But not make keys. My father never let me make keys. But all of those things informed how I grew up. And they had backbreaking work. We would eat dinner at 8:30 at night, but my parents always made sure that we had dinner together, regardless of the time. Everyone had to sit at the table and eat, right? And so what that taught me was that I have to find the places where I can actually connect with my family. Like, what are those specific things for my husband and I where they're non-negotiables, right? And so for me, it's bedtime. Like, I can drive anywhere in the world. You want me in Buffalo tomorrow, I'll be there, but I'm coming home to see my kids, right? If I'm gonna be abroad for too long, I wanna make sure that I have time so that I can go to a concert where they can see me out in the crowd, that I find the time to be able to go to a PTA conference, that I'm answering questions about a Regents exam. Like, finding out those spaces are, for me, how I navigate through all of them. During the pandemic, my children learned so much more about my job because of telework. Right?
Yeah.
So they were joined. My daughter used to joke that she was, how are my coworkers doing? Like, get out of the camera, kid. Like, you're not in this. But she learned, and all of my girls learned a lot about who my coworkers were, what I did for a living, and having that joy of talking to them about it was actually really quite exceptional. I think my parents have always blended personal life and home. We used to joke that they had so many children so that they could staff the hardware store, right? They're like, I'm one of 4. It's a little true and a little terrible to say. But,
Is your mom watching?
No, she probably, I've said this before, and she always stopped talking about this. But, I will say that for me, it has made it more comfortable when there's a little bit of blending of work and home, as long as I can figure out what are the things that I need to do in order to be more resilient with my family. Because at the end of the day, that's what's most important, right? So.
And that's the life balance, right? We figure out how to make life work with life, right? I want to talk about some of the things you mentioned in terms of how we are working together. And, the governor's work in supporting Caribbean organizations. I know that about a year ago, she announced that New York State will establish a Caribbean trade office. Can you tell me where we are in the process, what we can anticipate, what can we expect from that?
So this is a great office that was created in the Economic State Development Corporation, or ESD. They do a lot of and spur different businesses within New York, right? That is our priority. It's creating all the factors that allow for New York to thrive, for businesses to thrive, for the economy to grow. And so one of the big areas that the governor's Global New York office is intended to do is to help with exports and products that are coming out from New York to get all around the world, but certainly in the Caribbean nations as well, where there's so much connectivity. So there are grants that exist, there are programs that exist from an outreach perspective, and our goal, they have an office now in Puerto Rico, is to really spur that trade, and that is their big focus area.
That's a wonderful thing. I think for us, being in the location we are, particularly SUNY Downstate, this is something for us to know and to figure out how we can be a part of that, because our community is largely Caribbean American. We want to make sure that whatever opportunities exist out there to expand and to grow and to enhance the work that we're doing and to help individuals, we want to be a part of that. So we can definitely figure out how we can follow through and work with something that you're working on.
And I think this is one of the wonderful things I think about the governor. First of all, as she's a first woman governor, but it's sort of, there's something about just being a woman that influences her leadership style. And so one thing I'll say as an observation is she cares very deeply about communities on and off the camera, right? So when she was lieutenant governor, she was everywhere. She saw every single county. But it also meant when challenges were happening, she was one of the first ones to ask those personal questions, whether it's in front of the camera or not. You know, Asian American hate crimes, the things that were happening right here in New York and elsewhere. She was there in Chinatown. She was there asking our staff how they were doing. She was asking very personal questions when the tragedies happened in Buffalo. And so all of those things were taking place. But it also means that when she became governor, she was focused on how we really support communities. And so, you know, the first Caribbean American Heritage Month event happened underneath this governor.
Yes. We were excited about that. Yes.
Incredible that ever happened. And like that type of just simple outreach, that instinctive type of piece of, you know, how do I make sure that the people that I'm surrounded by are sort of reflective of
who
New
we
York.
are.
And she says it all the
Exactly.
time, right? Like we need to have the diversity of the state needs to be represented in state government, but also that she's showing up in communities. And so I think when it came to the creation of Global New York, I think it was a priority for her. She had heard it from her team members, but also making sure that there are natural points where we can have conversations like this, where if SUNY Downstate wasn't in the conversation already, then we're gonna have to figure out how to make that happen. And
We're
so,
listening, right?
Oh, yeah. So, you know, and that's one of the beauties is making sure that
Yes.
when we have these rooms, these conversations, we're cognizant of who's at the table and who's not.
Right, and it's critical for us all to be at the table, considering, you know, the last number of years, how things have gone across the globe, you know, and much more specifically in a community like ours, you know, thinking about how we struggle through the pandemic, you know, being named as a COVID-only hospital, you know, we were in the apex, and our numbers indicated how difficult it was for us. Something about somewhere like 90% of the people that we lost in the two immediate zip codes serving Downstate, 11225 and 11203, about 90% of the people that we lost were people of color, at least 2 or 3 comorbidities, and a minimum age of 69. So there's still a lot of work to be done. You know, we've done a lot of work in terms of vaccines and education, but there still is work to be done.
You know, so I will say, just on this one note, that's why it's so important that the groundwork happens before a public health crisis takes place, right? It's incredibly important that communities know that they can trust healthcare workers. It's really important that that outreach and that connection takes place so that when there's an issue that happens, that you're seeing someone talk about a vaccine to you, right? Like that simple thing. I know in my family, there were certainly some concerns, particularly Caribbean, and I don't mean to push too much on it, but I think that sort of skepticism on medicine, right? Because it existed, and what are the relationships between whether it is a nonprofit like the one that I served in, or like a SUNY Downstate, you know, how do we connect with our communities to make sure that they're hearing us too, right?
No, it's very important.
And also, you know, making sure that the public health leaders that are talking about this, that we're doing so in a way that is thinking about our communities. But all of this has to happen in advance, right? So if there are lots of comorbidities that are happening in our communities, if diabetes is a problem, if there's, you know, greater issues around, you know, cardiovascular health and other areas that is going to be exacerbated by a pandemic. And so that means we can't just say, oh, we can finally take off our masks, or these vaccines are important. The hard work of actually connecting with communities still has to continue, because if anything, this pandemic has brought to the forefront the challenges that have always existed, that you feel on a day-to-day basis. And so, you know, it's really important for all of us to really not just lose track that this crisis took place, but also that we've got to structurally change the way that we do our work and how we talk about how we approach it.
The hard work begins now, and you know, our colleagues here at SUNY Downstate, particularly on the UHD side, University Hospital of Downstate side, I mean, you can see the work being done. And there's been a recommitment to the work of serving our community. The compassion exists, and it's something that we really want people to understand. You know, we struggled like the community, like everybody else. We had our losses as well, we had our fears, but you know, understanding from leadership how critical this is, we want to make sure that everybody has access to the same opportunities that we did internally, so that you can take care of yourself. And it's something that we continue to stress, and it's something that our folks on the hospital side continue to stress, because they know how important it is to be a safety net hospital in a community like ours, where only 12% of our community are fully insured. So it tells you the struggle that we're in. And we continue to make inroads, but of course there are challenges. So we look for partners like the governor's office and other entities to help us get the word out, to help us provide what we need to bring to the table.
I think that's, and I think that's, SUNY Downstate played such a vital role during the pandemic, and it's always played such a vital role in the community. I mean, I think in Brooklyn in particular, where there are places where there are just deserts of access, right? And so it behooves us all to really think about that primary care access, that community health component of it, and just thinking about all of the factors that are impacting our individual health or the barriers to even seeking care. And that, again, that goes back to, am I willing to see a primary care physician? Am I going to identify a problem early? Am I going to talk to my family about the issues that are taking place? Am I going to create an environment where I'm also giving myself permission to take care of my own health? Which I don't know that every, I should not say for all communities, but I can see it within my own family in terms of my aunts and my uncles and my parents, when they will ignore an issue versus when they'll actually take care of it.
Yeah.
And usually it's at the,
It's at the end, right? They have to take care of it,
it's
yes.
like, oh, I saw this thing, but I'm not gonna,
Yeah.
But those are important conversations to have, and I do feel, for me, I try to think that proactive health component has to be something I always ask about early. Right?
It is. And I know that's one of the things that we work on very, very, very closely here because we understand the community that we have is so very diverse. But I want to go back to something that you just said, and there's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek humor there. Every Caribbean family has a home remedy, right?
Oh, God.
The bush tea, the
God.
the Vicks, Vicks.
Vicks
I
fixes
understand.
everything. It fixes
Vicks,
nothing.
Vicks, it's just wonderful. Just have some Vicks and you'll be okay.
But I don't understand how, if you put it on the bottom of your soles, right? It's on your, right? How does this do anything? I would say this, like, it is on your feet, I swear. Like,
Funnier one for you. We used to swallow Vicks. Yes. It was about 10, 12 years ago that I realized one day, I'm like, wait, this is do not ingest. I've been doing this all my life. I guess I'm still alive, but I did stop. I want you all to know I stopped. But I raised my children, so that's what happened. But I raised my children with Vicks. And my son, he spent some time in Asia, he said, are you packing Vicks for me? I said, yes, I did. I had the little ones. I packed Vicks. My oldest son, when he wasn't feeling well recently, was like, do you want me to put some Vicks on you? He's like, really? He was like, okay. But this is what we do. And this is the challenge, Here's the other funny thing. When I had my first child many years ago, the Guyanese tradition is you don't bathe for 9 days. Don't ask me why. And then you have to have castor oil. Don't ask me why. And I had my husband take my mother home so I could sneak a shower.
This is the thing, because you also can't cross your mother-in-law.
Yes, you can't, right? So there's so many things. But we're unique in that sense because there's always a home remedy. Go in the backyard, pick some bush, do this, and you're okay.
Well,
it's not unlike any other community, right, with its unique, traditions and things. But one of the things I enjoy about being here at SUNY Downstate is that we have such a diverse group of folks who are working with us, that they understand these challenges and can then listen to somebody and say, well, here, I understand this, but here's what we need to do for you on this end, And it's not to minimize the beliefs or the practices. It's really to say, here, we hear you, we understand why this is important to you, but here's what we can do from a medical perspective and a clinical perspective that really does help make a difference for you. Because sometimes, again, they don't come to the hospital until it's a little too late.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. And even when you're in the hospital, that you're communicating that you're not feeling well, right? Like, are you willing to press that call button? Are you going to tell all of your symptoms? My father, whom I love, so as you know, he had cancer not too long ago. And so we would go to the hospital and he would come in and he had a way of saying he was always monitoring his blood pressure and he always swore that it was wrong. So he would take the reading and he would say, absolutely wrong, right? Or we went to the hospital and they took his reading and I remember he said to me, he's like, the front desk, he sat down, I guess really quiet, and he goes, so they told me I should go to the emergency room because my blood pressure is too high. I was like, you sat there for 20 minutes and you didn't tell me your blood pressure reading was so high they wanted you to walk downstairs. He's like, I was just mad at the guy in front of me. It was just, He was so rude. And that was raising my blood pressure, so I think they should just retake it. And I thought in my head, are you crazy, right? But these are places where, always having a conversation about it, because I think for him, my father is, and I think this isn't a unique thing, a very proud man, right? Always here to take care of his family, not here to acknowledge that he's human in certain ways, doesn't want us to feel worried, right? So simple things by just saying, this is not an issue, right? I'm not gonna acknowledge that it's a problem, even though it's there. And so just even like kind of recognizing that, right? I remember thinking, I was looking at him, I was like, he's a little too quiet right now, right? Those like small little tells. But those can also be informed, again, in the hospital setting, as you're asking those questions, who's taking your temperature and following up on these pieces.
No, and it's critical. I mean, I had a similar experience. My dad, he's no longer with us, but after he passed, we found the CD in his drawer with the report that said we should have been looking at X, Y, and Z. And I said, Dad, how was your appointment? Oh, everything is fine.
Yep.
So, and this is because they either are afraid because it's not something they're used to. They're the ones taking care of you. They're the ones, who are, helping to create things for you. But they don't want to talk about the things that are happening to them. Right. So it's the pride factor as well. I'm here to take care of my family. This is what we do. Don't worry about me. So it's a constant thing, and we recognize that when people come into Downstate, we recognize that, and we're able to talk to people because we have to help them understand that, yes, you do have a family member at home who can help you, but here we are here to help you as well. So this is a critical thing, and even as when you think about the language access, how critical that is.
It's funny, and I think when folks say representation matters, right? I feel like there's almost a politicizing about that, and you think, well, what does that actually mean? And I think representation matters because if you don't have individuals that reflect the diversity of the community that you serve, you're not asking always the right questions, right? And it's not out of malice, right? It's not out of, it's sometimes a little bit out of ignorance. But I think if you aren't exposed and you're not asking questions and you don't have those cultural touchstones, sometimes you can miss pieces. And that's actually one of the beauties of having and seeing diversity at all levels, right? I think the other side of it is, when you're a person of color, whatever is your whatever community you're a part of, and you are a staff member versus when you're in a leadership role, you can feel different types of pressure. About when you verbalize and when you identify, and am I going to be pigeonholed, and what do these pieces look like? But at the end of the day, if you're not bringing forward those touchstones of the things that and how they apply, you're missing out on part of the most important aspects of your leadership.
And that's why diversity is so very critical, because we can really care for people in a different way once we understand the cultural differences, the societal differences, financial differences, because 100%. There's so many other things that we need to be aware of as we're welcoming people and treating them here at SUNY Downstate and our hospital.
It's funny. So have you been back to Trinidad? Or have you gone to Trinidad yet? I forgot if
I passed through.
You passed through.
But I was in Guyana last year for about 3 weeks. So, does that help?
This is a completely side point, but do you remember BWI?
Yes.
So
British Airways.
Do you ever, when you fly BWI, what I used to love about that is I felt like I was getting onto a taxi cab. Because sometimes, you get on it, they maybe you're leaving at 11, maybe you're leaving at 4, right? Maybe you're getting to Trinidad, and maybe they're stopping over in another Caribbean nation to pick up more passengers, which actually...
The taxi.
Yes, which happened all the time. So I'm wondering, did you stop off in Trinidad because of BWI, or did you actually?
I think it was a United Airlines flight many moons ago, and we went through and to go to Guyana. I had to go overnight. We had to overnight in Trinidad, and then get up to go on a 5 o'clock plane the next morning to get to Guyana. I'm like, why couldn't we just fly there? But I know it's different now.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of airlines that are serving it. My hope is to bring my kids back because. That is part of their culture, right? That is part of my culture. It's informed a lot of my values and how I see the world, and I don't want them to lose that.
No,
right?
That's very important.
And there's so much warmth when you go back and you see your family. It's funny, I go back with my husband, he's like, oh, it's so much work because you've got to see everyone,
Yes.
You've got to touch base.
You've got to send a barrel before you go.
Yeah, no, this is true. And the things they expect you to bring down is always like, oh, just send the barrel. Don't make me.
Right.
I remember my grandmother used to, why do I tell these stories? She used to hide as much as she could traveling up. Like, I think she used to put mangoes in, in shoes, in socks, rolled up,
Yes.
like, in underwear, like all types of things. And like
every agricultural rule has been broken, okay?
100%. Shanna, she would freeze all types of things as though she could make it in. And anytime it didn't show up at the other end, she would swear that Customs
took it.
Customs took it. They didn't throw it away. They took my mangoes. I was like, oh,
yes,
okay.
I can tell you how many times, my mother said, I'm going to pack this roti and take it because they're not going to have roti in the U.S. Yes, I do.
No, but it's not this. Well, I will say there are certain things that when you eat it back in Trinidad or anywhere else, it tastes different.
There's a different dynamic. You're right. You're right.
Even the KFC in Trinidad tastes different. Like, I swear that, right?
It's actually much better, I'm sure.
The chicken tastes different, right? If you have mac and cheese, like the macaroni pie in Trinidad, the cheese is, my cousin
real cheese.
My cousin will say the government cheese tastes better in Trinidad. Right? So, there are all different types of things where it doesn't, and it is very hard also to make callaloo up here. Right?
Yeah, that's
because
true.
to get all the ingredients, right? Like whether it's like pigtail or bush or whatever else it might be, then making that good old Sunday stew after, my mother used to tell me, it's like yummy spinach soup. I'm like, this is not. But it's so good. It's comfort food.
No, it is comfort food.
And those are things where, it's funny, food is such a good connector between
it is.
any community.
Any
and just
community,
being able to share the wealth of foods. And in Trinidad, again, it's been colonized by everyone. It also everyone has some presence there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether you are Indian, Chinese, Black, Jewish, whatever, everyone has a presence there too. And so it's made all the food very fascinating as well, right? Just all mixed together.
Well, just so you know, I brought you some food today.
I know, I'm so excited.
I made sure that I got the bacon saltfish for Georgina. And I got your doubles.
I'm all about doubles.
And some peas and rice I cooked yesterday. Because, I have to bribe her, but it was okay.
Oh, no, anytime.
But I must tell you, I remember when she was bringing masks to my house during the pandemic, she says, listen, I'm stopping at Trin City. And she left the bag on the door because I probably wasn't home or I don't know what, but she left the bag with the Trin City doubles on the door. I made sure I got them quickly.
I was thinking that because I know your neighbors, and they have the woman next door who has the Scotch bonnet peppers.
Yes.
Oh,
so
the pepper sauce is
phenomenal.
Very
this
important.
is one of the things that we do claim. Every Caribbean island has the best pepper sauce.
Trinidad actually has the best pepper sauce.
Okay, whatever.
You can put your tiny little flag down. You do know what it's on. Your lapel pin.
My lapel pin is in honor of Trinidad today,
the only other thing,
obviously.
And the birthplace of the steel pan is Trinidad.
Yes, ma'am.
So for all those Jamaicans out there where everyone seems to claim credit, they all think that, right? You can keep your jerk chicken, but I have the steel pan, right? So these are also very important things.
And we have our pepper pot, which is unlike Jamaican pepper pot. Ours is so much different and so much better.
Oh,
I must say.
Okay.
Let's move back to something a little less volatile. We're talking food conversations in the Caribbean are phenomenal.
I do have to say, the thing that you were asking me before, the food that I miss, I cannot make curry goat very well. I'm very scared of pressure cookers, I'll be honest.
Oh, you don't need a pressure cooker. You can use a crock pot. You can. It's a lot easier. Okay, we'll have to have that conversation.
But
we'll have to have a conversation.
Goat is one of those things. Curry goat is one of my butts up shot. One of my favorite foods. Like a good paratha, a good whether it's that but pilau is actually my favorite thing in the world. My grandfather made pilau, and do you know what I also love is that. When you are a good cook in Trinidad, you will not share your secret ingredients.
No, it's not just in Trinidad. In Guyana, nobody knows what I put in my pepper pot. It's always good though.
This is 100% true. Not only that, I have my aunt whom I love. She does catering, right? And she will let us help her make some food and then kick us out at a certain point. So we don't see what.
You don't know what else is going in there.
100%. And then and the one thing here is one place in which I think I've seen my family speak duplicitously is about each other's cooking. Oh, did you try your uncle's oil down? It is not as good as mine.
And you can't say, you're right.
No, you can't.
You can't. You simply can't.
You just, okay, Auntie.
Just leave it alone.
That's all you can do. Well, you're going to have to come up when we do a West Indian or a Caribbean Heritage Month event up in Albany.
I'm there.
Right? That is
absolutely.
One of the beauties of representation is that you get to say, we are going to celebrate.
I'm
So.
absolutely there. So before we move on, we're going to take a couple of questions. I know there are folks in the chat who are going to be taking some questions. I believe that Dr. Gwen, and I forgot to tell you all, I apologize. Dr. Gwen has been stuck trying to get back to New York the last day or so.
Aww.
So when you see that it says hosted by Dr. Gwen, I'm Dr. Gwen today. So Dr. Gwen, thank you. I'm so sorry that you weren't able to make it back in time, but selfishly speaking, I am having a really, really good time talking to Jeanette here today. We don't get enough time to spend together. I do want to go back to the work that you're doing at OGS. In your role as commissioner, what are some of the challenges you face walking in the door?
So I will say, so I came in an interesting time, right? I was one of the first hires where the governor brought someone in. And as you know, I worked at the Attorney General's office as well. There is a piece of women stepping into leadership roles and voids, right? And I think, the transition between the last governor to this governor, she was filling in positions, right? And setting what is her agenda, what are my priorities, and sort of stepping in to try to make sure that we had both continuity from a government, like from a services perspective, but also started to identify what do we need to have that's different. And I think one of her top priorities was creating a collaborative culture, like a culture where you're not just doing the things functionally, but you're also telling people your opinion. And is this the right thing? Can you prove it, right? Are these would you defend this decision? What data tells you to do this? And sort of living those values so that you are collaboratively working. The state of New York had been losing a lot of staff due to attrition. We lost a lot of staff during the pandemic, people who had retired, decided to move on, and there had been many years where there was no permission to be able to backfill positions, hire new staff, and so there's a whole set of employees that were completely missing in government. And so figuring out not just how do I stabilize my organization, but also how do I rebuild in a way that makes sense, right? And I think the other part of it is setting what that agenda looks like in the future. Her priorities, the governor had been focusing on sustainability. She was focusing on fixing structural issues. And I will say, not just at OGS, one of the things that I've loved working about with Governor Hochul, and again, this is a women's leadership piece, she wasn't just looking for how do I fix it this year, but how do I structurally fix it? How do I fix the root of the problem? So, how do I look at fixing MTA funding? How do I look at fairly funding schools? Things that, there were lots of budget techniques over the last, few years of fixing it for this year, but not the next, but how do I create structural changes? And so when I came into OGS, I was looking to not just communicate to my team that I was here for a short-term period, right? Because I was coming in before the new administration, before she had won a first term. And so reminding them, I've been with the state before, I'm here to help you. I actually moved my family to Albany, as you know, communicating that there's stability at the top and that we weren't just looking again for short-term fixes, we were looking for structural solutions. And so that was one of my top priorities. OGS also was an agency in which, and there are lots of really incredible staff that work there, not a very diverse place. And one of my top priorities was also having a leadership team that reflected the diversity of our state. And I'm very proud to say that we have one of the most diverse leadership groups of any agency, and certainly in the history of our agency altogether. And that has influenced how we ask questions, right? And so making sure that we have individuals of color, we have women, we have people from all different age groups and spectrums, just thinking about all of our problems holistically. It helps us to ask better questions and decide whether or not we're putting forth the best answers. So, we had talked a little bit about even just things like vehicles, right? And asking the question in terms, who needs to have access to charging? Will our staff have home chargers? What do we need to provide in terms of support? What are those incentives that need to be created? What are the infrastructure components? How does energy need to be factored in? Pieces around language access, again, like all of these are areas in which having a diverse leadership team where we're willing to question maybe so that we're not just saying, well, we've always done it that way, right? And sort of breaking through, there's a safety in saying we've always done it that way, right? You're not sticking out your neck if you're following tradition. If you're telling someone to go in a different direction, then you can feel like that decision is on you, right?
Right.
And with all the consequences that come out of it. So from a risk perspective also, infinitely less risky to say we've always done it that way. And so sort of changing the culture where you can also feel comfortable questioning those decisions,
Right.
even if you end up back at the old path, that you've gone through the process of thinking that through, that it was a very big change coming in. And so, there were a lot of shifts in terms of, how do we staff, what are our priorities? And I think, I'm right now coming up on my second year, and, I think they say this always in jobs, right? Your first year is the company or the organization investing in you, and the second year, you should be investing in the
Same company,
organization. And
yeah.
so this is my year where I've learned enough about my organization that I feel like I'm starting to really cook with gas. I've got the right people in the right places, that we are evaluating the problem similarly, right? As in, what I say by that is not that we have groupthink, but that we know enough about the facts on the ground that we can equally diagnose the problem. And that can be a challenge too, in terms of normalizing a leadership group and making sure that you're fixing the right issue, right? Because they're all different parts of the elephant, right? And how do you decide, which one you're fixing and that you're doing so in concert? And so, that was a big piece coming in. And I will say, just on the last note, one of my big challenges were, this goes back to whether you call it imposter syndrome or whatever else it might be. I am one of the youngest people to ever lead this organization. I am the second woman. I'm the second individual of color. I'm the first Asian American. I am, I think, the first New York City resident potentially. And there's an upstate bias a little bit, and I don't think it's intended to be. But coming from someone who had been working in the city for a long time, showing that I can think statewide to even
That's
my
critical.
team members, it is actually really critical. And those pieces of, those are basic things around trust, and whether or not people trust that you're looking out for the best of their intentions and for looking for them out overall. Like, those are very important pieces. I will say, just going back to my heritage, learning to always talk to people equally and not talk down, talking to folks in the same tenor, with the same words, or at least the same intent as you would in any room. The things that my family taught me to do, that's really served me well in this job. Also, I'll joke around, I know my team have heard me say this, I am not smart enough to keep track of saying different things in different places, right? It's like infinitely easier to just tell you what I mean here, so that
Right.
later on when you hear it, right, I don't have to think about the story that I had. It always has to be consistent. And that's something I learned a lot from my grandmother, right?
Tell the same story in every
Yes,
room.
just be true to yourself and be
Right.
honest. Like that, I used to cringe, and I was joking about this before, I used to cringe at the honesty from my family, the bluntness of it. But the truth is that approach and bringing that what I consider my authentic leadership style to the table was really helpful to overcome learning about the organization, changing the culture. I mean, I don't want to say that this is, we're 18 months in. Are we at the beginning of it or at the end of it? There's so much more culture change that has to happen. And frankly, also trying to make sure, going back to where I've really enjoyed working with the governor, is trying to make sure that you're fixing the problem once, right? Take the time to understand it so that you are fixing it today, so that next year you can face a new problem. Because there's
Right,
always
and then
a new
there's a
problem.
roadmap that you're building,
100%.
right?
And that was actually also some of our training, right? When we back in our city hall days,
Yes.
right? Was how do you fix it today? How do you think about the structures so that next year you're thinking about new problems?
Right, and that helps you set the bar higher too.
100%,
Yeah.
right? And the more that you can communicate those issues, the more people want to work with you too, right? And I think that's the other interesting thing about when you think about diversity and you think about recruitment, that when you see someone that looks like you, that has your experience in different positions or in different areas, all of a sudden you can imagine it, right?
It's
You can-
amazing.
and there's a real, when I was growing up, I don't know that I could have imagined someone like me in this job, right? I don't know that I could have imagined where I would have headed, but I know what that power is for everyone sort of behind. So conversations like this, whether it is, in a room acknowledging our shared heritage, or, with my children or their schools, those are important things for me to find out how to prioritize, because I know what that power looks like, right? Because it's that, it is not that folks aren't imaginative. You can read a book and picture yourself as any character. But to think that you can overcome all the biases that may exist, all the concerns, and then really be successful. I think when you get to this place, there's a moment where you have to take that moment and to carve out space to talk about it.
That's true. So your work has been mostly in public service, correct?
I was in the private sector for about 10 years, 8 years.
And what is it about the public sector and public service that has drawn you and kept you there?
Well, so I worked at a consulting firm. Try to not tell everyone that, but the reason why is that shouldn't say anything bad about consulting, but there's so much more beauty in being able to fix the problems, right? And that there's such a and I'm sure for many healthcare workers you feel the same, right? Like you are fixing things, you are helping people, and that direct connection between the work that you're doing actually impacting those around you, that sense of community. I love that, right? I love the idea that every day I'm coming to work and I'm fixing a problem that is going to change New York. And I remember even when we worked together in the city, we always used to talk about the actions that you have to take in our groups to impact the mayor's office, right? I was in a group of 40. It was like a matter of seesaws, right? Like you've got to take a lot of actions over here to move the mayor's office. So the 400 people at the time, there were about 400, to impact all, a couple of 400,000 city employees, you've got to swing pretty hard. And if you actually want to impact, everyone else in New York, the 8.75 million New Yorkers that are served in the region, you've really got to move very hard in order to impact them. And, thinking about how your action, whether it is this Office of Language Access, whether it is thinking about building codes or sustainability, or how we create like a greener grid and access for vehicles, those are very directly things that I can tie back to my children and whether or not I'm making their world better. It makes it a lot easier to think about the sacrifices that you could be happening on a day-to-day basis because you feel like you are really shifting, you're shifting the way that government interacts with people. I mean, even something as simple as the other day, I told folks, I really hate seeing the word citizen, right? Like there are certain triggers that I have, and because not every New Yorker is a citizen.
Right.
Right?
You're right.
But it would show up in all these, I would get documents and I'd cross it out and they would sort of come back with citizen, cross it out again, right? But those specific instances where you're thinking, well, does government think broadly, right? Are we coming to the table across all areas? Are we thinking holistically, or are we stuck in our narrow silos? And just having the opportunity to sort of think through those things are very important. It's what's kept me in public service for many years.
The word that does it for me, similar to you for citizens, is disadvantage.
Disadvantage.
That disturbs me to no end. And the other one is at risk. Everybody's at risk. Everybody's at risk for something. So how do you distinguish who is at risk for X, Y, and Z? So those are my two triggers.
Oh, so, no, that's really good to know. And it's interesting because it's interesting how all of our experiences change the way in which we lead.
Yeah.
Right? And it changed the way in which we act as individuals. So
one of the things I enjoy about being in public service, and I spent maybe 3 or 4 years in the corporate world, it was not the place for me in finance and banking, much less for a woman on a trading floor, less so for a woman of color. And I ended up with my first job in nonprofit. It was then called Food for Survival. It's now known as New York City Food Bank. Never looked back. And I was in nonprofit world for some time, and then I joined the Bloomberg administration, and I was there through the sunset of the administration. But what I learned there was that public service was my calling. And much like you feel like you're accomplishing something working in the public and providing something to people who really are looking for a benefit.
that's 100% right. And that's why, I joke about consulting, but it didn't feel direct for me.
Right.
Like I was doing consulting for governments, I was doing it for Fortune 1s, and it just doesn't feel direct, right? When you're doing the work, it's so incredibly gratifying.
It is.
Right? And you think about all the complex challenges that are happening, climate change, this pandemic, all types of things that are happening in the world, to be a part of a movement to make it better in a very structural fashion. And government there's so many bureaucracies to it, so many layers that folks don't understand about the levers and the requirements, and the idea that somehow you're making it better or easier to understand, that's, there's something that's really powerful about it as well.
There is. So what would be your spiel? This will be the last question before we may take a question or two. What would be your spiel, if you will, to engage somebody to go into public service?
Honestly, I think there is no greater calling in public service. Like no matter what your job or no matter what your skill is, you can apply to government setting. You can be an engineer, you can be an architect, you can be a doctor, you can do all those areas in public service, but your job in public service is to serve the public. It is to serve our communities. It is to serve your parents and your children and your neighbors, and that is a blessing, right? And so, my big calling for this, because I do think there is honor and valor in public service, is that you can take any skill that you have and apply in a government setting, and you are making your community better. And if you aren't sitting in that seat, someone else is with maybe different decision-making that you are, right? So sometimes you also have to make sure that you are a part of that game. Our communities are represented so that we are also doing that great work that needs to happen.
And that was one of the blessings about working in the mayor's office. We literally and figuratively had a seat around the table of policy that was being made. And that's unique in itself. So for us to be able to do that, and then you're able to bring it into the world that you're doing, the work that you're doing now, I mean, what better training ground?
100%. And it's funny, one of the things that I love, so I was just having a conversation not too long ago about what were the great approaches that I learned during the mayor's office. And I think it was always a framework of what's the problem that you're trying to solve? Who else is doing it? Problems aren't unique, right? What's Chicago doing? What's LA doing? And then forget about London, but all of these areas, because New York is unique, but you want to see what other practices exist.
Right.
And then how does it apply, right? So you're not remaking the wheel, that you're building on the strength of other efforts. And, and I think the other big piece, I remember we used to have that countdown clock. Oh, I hated that clock. But I loved it too, because it reminded you that your time here is limited, that there's something so immortal about that.
Yeah,
right?
there is.
But your time is limited, and that means that your time to change structures, to change policy, to change the way that government functions, that's also limited too, right? And that is something that has very much informed me today, because I think, this job, I hope to be here for a long time, because I love public service and I love this organization. But I also know that I want to leave it in a better place. And so what tools do I need to create so that the next person stepping in can have clarity into my organization, right? So like we think about things like performance management or data. When I think about sort of, some of our strategic planning work, just making sure that you are talking about, where you're headed and why. And one of the great things, as as we left, was we all wrote guides. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Write a guide to your agency,
Yes.
right? What is the budget? How many people? What were your priorities? What are your big contracts? So that you're handing over the keys.
Literally handing over the keys.
That they're walking over and feeling prepared. And there is a real beauty to thinking about an institution as broad as something that is lasting, where you're making it better so that when someone else comes in, that you are replaceable.
Yes.
Right? And not in a way that's everyone wants to feel like they're
Well, it's the
important, but
evolution. It's the
100%.
evolution. Absolutely.
you want to set up the next person for success.
Yes.
So also something really great that I think happened during that time.
Sounds good. So I know that we're going to be wrapping up soon. We wondered if they had any questions from the chat or anybody in the audience.
We have two questions from the
Okay.
chat. You mentioned Dr. Gwynn, and this question is coming from Dr. Gwynn.
We're missing you, sir.
So, assuming the Commissioner of General Services was not the original career goal, what was your career aspiration growing up?
Oh, whew, what age? I was very impressionable. I really wanted to be Jacques Cousteau for a brief period of time, a marine biologist. I think, I used to love swimming in the waters in Trinidad. I used to love Tobago in particular. Trinidad, as you know, Trinidad's waters were not as clean where I was growing up, just because it has oil and natural gas, and not all companies were kind to the environment during that time. But I think just going down to to Store Bay, going to Tobago, I always thought about doing that professionally, right? So that was one. There was a period in time in which I wanted to be Secretary of State, right?
Nice.
Madeleine Albright. I could see her. I could be that.
Of course.
Something very real. There's a woman in this role. I can study. I can be that. Lots of different things. I thought I would be an attorney. Did not end up being an attorney. I'm more on the operations side, which I love. So all different types of things.
Great. We had a question in the audience,
Go ahead.
and then we'll come back to that one.
Hello, my name is Stephen Rose, and
Hi.
I'm from the beautiful island of Jamaica. And thank you so much for being here today. And my question is, with this also being Caribbean Heritage Pride Month and LGBTQ Pride Month, can you speak of any initiatives that your office is either currently working on or creating that is specifically addressing Caribbean LGBTQ grassroots organizations? Because a lot of times in conversations like these, we talk about so many communities, talk about
Yeah.
inclusion, but I often don't hear anything about the LGBTQ community, especially the Caribbean LGBTQ community.
That's a great question, and thank you for that. One of the things that we've been doing, so OGS has a lot of different purviews. One of the areas that we do have are some of our cultural programming space up in Albany. And the reason why I point to that is there's a real opportunity to think about how we influence policymakers in terms of the diversity of the state. Right, so we do events on what we call in the Capitol building, what we call the concourse, and the Empire State Plaza, and we have both elected officials, legislators, we have our executive chamber in the governor's office, state employees, those that influence policy. And one of the things we've been trying to do is really diversify the types of programming that we have and also lift up voices in a different fashion. And so as an example, we do exhibits for every month. This was the first time that we had done in the last 2 years since I arrived, Asian American Heritage Month. This year, we did our first drag show out on the concourse, right? Trying to do more work around making sure that all of the programming that we create is representative of our communities. And so I'm really glad that you lifted it up, because one of the questions I'll be asking next year is how are we incorporating that into our programming next year? I will say I am a little embarrassed that we did not do a Caribbean American Heritage Month event this year, right? And so can we celebrate and bring a steel pan up or whatever else that might be?
We're there.
Are you in? Right? There are certainly a lot of things that we do on behalf of the governor's office, but there are things that my agency can do on its own. So how we incorporate that is going to be important. We've also been talking about, from a procurement perspective, we think about how we do outreach in terms of making sure that all communities are aware that the government purchases services. We're a buyer of services, we're a buyer of products, right? Making sure that all communities are getting equal access to know about, how do I do business with government? So I'd be really curious to make sure that are we outreaching to everyone that we need to, right? There are so many individuals that are of Caribbean descent that are creating products and creating services, and do they know how to sell to government? Those are things that we can also take part in. But I really think, this has been a very hard set of years for lots of communities. The LGBTQ community in particular has had both issues around violence that have been perpetrated, trying to erase identity, and that's been happening all across the country. We were very proud to do a Pride event this year when we did the drag show, because in a moment where everyone else was retreating from it, we were doing events where we can celebrate. And so I'll be thinking about for next year's event, because we will do it again next year, if there is a Caribbean presence there as well, right? And there's actually, I will say, there are a lot of Guyanese in Schenectady.
We're everywhere. We're everywhere.
There are some. There are a significant number of Jamaicans as well. There need to be more Trinis. I've heard there's one Trini. There's
that might be you.
That's right. There's one Trinidadian restaurant I've heard that is going to be opening up this summer. So I'm really looking forward to it. It's a gentleman who's making pepper sauce. And now he's going to be opening up a restaurant. But I do think, with all jokes aside, when I think about some of our cultural offerings, that's a place where we can celebrate, we can uplift, we can make sure that voices aren't erased. And that's something that absolutely my agency can do. Absolutely.
I think we have one last question.
Commissioner, this is from Florence in the chat. Commissioner, does Brooklyn have the largest Caribbean community in New York State? And are there or will there be specific outreach projects you are working on that directly affect the surrounding downstate Caribbean community?
That's a great question. So the answer is yes. I'm pretty sure that is yes. I feel like I have the statistics somewhere. Let's see now. We'll go to the papers. New York accounts for 25% of Caribbean Americans living in America, and most live in Brooklyn or Kings County, 277,300. There were also a lot in Queens,
Yes.
just, you know. But we are doing more programs and more events. I am looking forward to how we can envelop that more. Most of OGS, most of our agency is situated in New York, up in Albany, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thoughtful around how all of our work connects. We do programs in Harlem. We have a state office building there. We do have a state office building that's also in Brooklyn. I am present personally in some of the community events that happen here. In fact, when the governor had her Caribbean American Heritage Month, it was right here in Brooklyn.
It was.
And so, you know, I think that we are, as representation happens, we are trying to be a lot more thoughtful about where we show up and how it gets included. So absolutely.
Right. Well, listen, everybody, thank you so much. Commissioner, I cannot thank you enough for being here.
Absolutely.
I truly appreciate the time that you've taken to come down in your electric vehicle. So we have to take you out to show you where we have our charging station. We're very happy to have hosted you, and we look forward to continuing our work with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.